January 7th, 2026, Buddhadhamma, chapter 11.7, page 1138, Path to Supreme Happiness. Developing more refined forms of happiness, sukha. Before describing refined forms of happiness, it is helpful here to describe the basic form of sukha and dukkha, happiness and suffering, that has a bearing on other forms of happiness. The following definition was given by Venerable Sariputra after he was asked by a wandering ascetic of the following question: Friend Sariputra, what is happiness in this Dhamma and discipline? And what is suffering? Dissatisfaction, friend, is dukkha in this Dhamma and Vinaya discipline. Satisfaction is sukha, is happiness. Anapariti, when there is dissatisfaction, anapariti, friend, this dukkha, this suffering is to be expected. When walking, one does not find happiness or contentment. When standing still, when sitting, when lying down, when in a village, when in a forest, when at the foot of a tree, when in an empty hut, when in the open air, when among a group of monks, one does not find happiness or contentment. When there is dissatisfaction, this dukkha, this suffering, is to be expected. Apariti, satisfaction. But when there is apariti, satisfaction, this sukha, this happiness, is to be expected. When walking, when one finds happiness and contentment. When standing still, when sitting, when lying down, when in a village, when in a forest, when at the foot of a tree, when in an empty hut, when in the open air, when among a group of monks, one find happiness and contentment, when there is satisfaction. Apariti. This sukha, this happiness, is to be expected. Following a list of analogies for happiness inherent in various stages of meditative absorptions of concentration, jhana, the last step before attainment of jhana is the abandonment of the 5 nivara, the 5 hindrances: sensual desire, kama chanda, ill will, apayata, sloth and torpor, dinna mita, restlessness and worry, uchaka, kukucha, and doubt, vichikika. When one abandons the 5 hindrances, nivarana, one experiences peace and contentment, which is the basis for experiencing the happiness of concentration, absorption of jhana. There are 5 similes for this initial peace and contentment. First, similar to joy and delight of a person who has borrowed money from a creditor, achieved success in his work, and paid off his debts with money to spare for supporting his family. Second, similar to joy and delight of a person who has recovered from a serious illness and regains his appetite and his physical health. Third, similar to joy and delight of a person who has released from imprisonment, is able to travel about freely and does not incur a fine. Fourth, similar to joy and delight of a person who has been emancipated from slavery, gains freedom and independence, and is able to move about as he pleases. And fifth, similar to joy and delight of a wealthy person who has carried his wealth across a long, dangerous, remote area, arrives safely at his destination. From here, one experiences the increasingly refined forms of happiness inherent in the four fine material jhanas. In the first jhana, which accompanied by applied attention, vitakka, sustained attention, vichara, bliss, piti, joy, sukha, and one-pointedness, ekaggata, a practitioner's body is permitted and suffused with bliss and joy, piti and sukha. No part of the body is left untouched with this piti and sukha, bliss and joy. This is similar to someone who is in the morning sprinkles water on bath powder contained in a bronze basin. By evening, the moisture has pervaded it inside and out, so that none of the powder is dispersed. In the second concentration meditation absorption jhana, which is accompanied by piti and sukha, bliss and joy, and one-pointedness, a practitioner's body is duly permitted and suffused with the bliss and happiness born of samadhi, of concentration. This is similar to the deep lake, whose waters spring entirely from below, and no other inflow, including rainfall, from above. The cool fount of water welling up would drench, steep, and pervade every part of the lake. In the third concentration meditation absorption of jhana, which is accompanied by joy and one-pointedness, a practitioner's body is truly permitted and suffused with joy. Devised of bliss, this is similar to a lotus plant growing in water, immersed in water, nourished by water. The cool water drenches, steeps, and pervades every part of the plant, but its tips to its roots. In the fourth concentration meditation absorption of jhana, which is accompanied by upekkha, equanimity, and one-pointedness, a practitioner pervades the entire body with a pure, bright mind. This is similar to a person who is completely covered from head to toe with an immaculate white cloth. Following on from this happiness of the four fine material concentration meditation absorptions of jhana is the happiness of the four formless jhanas, which similarly becomes increasingly more refined. Although the happiness of the concentration meditation absorption of jhana is superior and more profound than the sense pleasure, it has defects and flaws. It is not yet perfect happiness. Gautama Buddha stated that the noble disciple Arya Vinaya, the five strands of sensual pleasure, kama guna, are called the world loka. In other words, the world loka is equivalent to the five sense pleasures of kama guna. One who is attached to sense pleasures is still bound up in the world. One who has attained fine material concentration meditation absorptions, or the formless concentration meditation absorption, is described as one who has reached and dwells in the zit, or limit, of the world. He or she is still connected to the world, however, has not yet escaped or transcended it. A person who passes beyond the last formless concentration, meditation, absorption of jhana, who attains the cessation of perception, nirota sanya, or sanya vetiya nirota, and feeling, sanya vetiniya nirota, is free from mental taints, asavas, through discerning satya with panya, so the discerning the truth with wisdom, is described as one who has reached the end of the world and has transcended both the bonds that bind beings to this world. The bonds that bind one to the world is a translation of visatika, which is usually equated with tanha, craving, longing, grasping, the desire for. It is sometimes translated as the shackle of tanha, the shackle of craving. The ultimate and complete form of sukha, happiness, belongs to someone whose mind is liberated. The happiness of one who has realized nibbita. This happiness includes the happiness associated with cessation of perception and feeling, sanya vittiya nirodha, which is the 10th kind of happiness mentioned in the list above. The most notable defects of happiness of concentration, meditation, absorption, either of the fine or the formless jhanas, are the following. The happiness of jhana is still completely free. It is still restricted, constrained by perception and other mental factors present in jhana. In a specific state of jhana, it is still possible for mental application connected to perceptions of inferior states of jhana to well up in the mind. The happiness of jhana is thus still prone to disturbance or agitation. Although the happiness of jhana is a form of non-material happiness, it is still subject to attachment. It may give rise to grasping, upatthana. It can be implemented for, it can be an impediment for realizing nibbita and perfect happiness. It is inadequate. It must transcend or abandon. It is conditioned phenomenon. It is fashioned by other mental causes and conditions. It is unstable. It is the very nature to subject to decline and cessation. Another important attribute of happiness of concentration, meditation, absorption, either of the fine material or the formless jhanas, is that it exists on the level of feeling and cessation, vedana. It arises as the result of cognizing sense objects or experiencing the pleasures of sense objects. This perspective of happiness of concentration, meditation, absorption, jhana shares attributes with sense pleasures. In short, it is the form of pleasurable sensation, sukha vedana. For this reason, the first 9 forms of happiness can all be classified as happiness dependent on cognitions of sense objects. Happiness beyond sensation. The distinction formed of happiness is the 10th and final form, which although is classified as sukha, happiness, it is not sensation vedana, nor does it require the enjoyment of sense objects. It can thus be called happiness beyond sensation. It refers to the happiness associated with the cessation of perception and feeling. Sanya veta niyita nirodha. A concentration state in which all the same implies is free from feeling or sensation. Some people may question how it can be a form of happiness if there is no sensation, because sukha, happiness, is technically one form of vedana, feeling. But as confirmed by these words of Gautama Buddha, there is a happiness that is not a sensation. Here, ananta, by completely transcending the base of neither perception nor non-perception, or in other words, being indifferent, a monk enters and dwells in cessation of perception and feeling. This is that other kind of happiness, more excellent, sublime than the previous kind of happiness, of base of neither perception nor non-perception. Now, it is possible that wanderers of other sects might speak thus. The aesthetic Gautama speaks of cessation of perception and feeling. He maintains that it is included in happiness. What is that? How is that? When wanderers of other sects speak thus, they should be told, the Blessed One, friends, does not describe a state as including in happiness only with reference to pleasant feeling, but rather, friends, wherever happiness is found in whatever way, tata, describes that state as included in happiness. The cessation of perception and feeling, sanya, veta, yita, nirota, is comparable to nibbita, and happiness independent of the enjoyment of sense objects, or happiness free from sensation. In this state is similar to the happiness of nibbita sukha. Venerable Sariputra explains this matter in the Nibbita Sutra, beginning with the statement, "Friends, this nibbita is happiness. This nibbita is happiness." Venerable Uttayi asks him how it is possible to have happiness in a state devoid of an enjoyment of sense object. Sariputra replies that nibbita, in which there is no enjoyment of sense object, there is no sensation, there's no vedana, is itself happiness. He then goes on to explain in the indirect way by using the various states of concentration of attainment as a comparison. He does not simply compare nibbita to the cessation of perception and feeling, but he describes the comparable aspects of each concentration absorption, jhana, beginning with the first, all the way explained to the happiness of nibbita. In each level of concentration of meditation, attainment, absorption, jhana, it is possible for mental application accompanied by perception, sanya, mana, sikara, associated with directly subordinate level of jhana, to well up in the mind. Take, for example, it is possible that for someone who has attained the third state of jhana, which is divested of bliss and endowed solely with joy and one-pointedness, to have perception of bliss well up. This mental application, accompanied by perception, is considered a disturbance and affliction for the person dwelling in jhana. The Pali term here used for disturbance and affliction is abhinya, which often denotes sickness or illness. Apata. It's not abhinya, apata. It is precisely this disturbance, afflictions, and lacks of ease that is referred to as dukkha, suffering. This is similar to someone who abides happily. The transition from happiness to unhappiness occurs as a result of some form of disturbance or agitation. Someone who is not disturbed by mental application accompanied by perception is thus fully absorbed in the state of jhana. Therefore, even without considering the aspect of sensation, the ordinary inherent condition of jhana is recognized as sukha, happiness. In other words, the inherent happiness of jhana is discernible when one applies the condition of disturbance and agitation for comparison. The spaciousness and ease inherent in each level of concentration, meditation, absorption, jhana, when there is no disturbance by mental application accompanied by perception, the effective comparison for explaining happiness of nibbita, the happiness of nibbita can thus be described as the state of freedom from fulfillment in which there is no disturbance or stress. Venerable Sariputra here uses the method for explaining happiness by comparing it to suffering, a natural state of completeness, free from stress and agitation. It itself is happiness. Arriving at freedom from suffering can be described in two ways. First, one may be oppressed and afflicted by something, or there is a sense of impairment and deficiency. To rectify the situation, one must escape from the source of oppression or bring the original state of fulfillment back to completion. Second, one may be provoked, inflamed, aroused, or stimulated, similar to the sense of impairment and deficiency. Here too, one must try and return to the original state of fulfillment. Ordinary people may refer to this gratification of desire, tanha, by rectifying an abnormal or dissonant situation as the pursuit of happiness or a reaping of happiness. In reality, however, what has occurred is that dukkha, suffering, stress, agitation has arisen. One has alleviated or stilled this dukkha and returned to a normal state of completeness. This explanation is consistent with definition of nibbita as a state free from illness, a state of perfect mental health. Gautama Buddha said that one may not recognize good health, physical strength and well-being, and the ability to move about unrestricted as happiness. But in that moment, one is not necessarily enjoying any sense impressions. But when one compares such health to illness and affliction, one appreciates the paramount importance of good health. In other words, when stricken by disease, one clearly sees how good health or freedom from illness is a sublime form of happiness. Just as there's absence of physical illness, a state of complete physical health and freedom from affliction is genuine happiness. So too, a mind free from blemish, from latent anxiety, and from attachment to sense objects exists in the state of true happiness. It is a spacious, expansive having realizing this happiness, one dwells with a balanced mind. The happiness, delight, clarity, and spaciousness of a liberated mind is the exclusive, exceptional providence of awakening beings. It is difficult for unawakened beings who have never shared this experience to fathom or conceive of it, but they can at least have an intuition that it is something truly excellent and noble. Perfect happiness. From the perspective of truth, sabhava, happiness that is still a sensation, vedana, or a happiness that is dependent on the enjoyment of sense object is in fact a form of dukkha, a form of stress and suffering. This is because sukha vedana, pleasurable sensations, is the same as other forms of sensation. Take, for the example, painful and neutral sensation, dukkha vedana and adukkha sukha vedana. They are conditioned phenomenon, sankhara dhamma. Here it refers to compounded things when encompassed with the five skandha, the five aggregates. It is not exclusively referring to volitional formation, sankhara as the fourth. All conditioned phenomena, sankhara dhamma, are subject to dukkha, to stress. This dukkha in the context of the tilakkana, anikata, dukkhata, anattata, tilakkana, the three characteristics as illustrated in discussion between the Buddha and one of the bhikkhus. One of the bhikkhus says, "Venerable Sir, while I was alone in seclusion, this reflection arose in my mind. The Blessed One has spoke about the three kinds of feeling: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and neither painful nor pleasant feeling. But the Blessed One has also said, whatever vedana, sensing of these sense object is classified as dukkha." Now with the reference to what was that said by the Blessed One? Gautama Buddha replied, Good, bhikkhu, I have spoken about these three kinds of feeling: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neither painful nor pleasant feeling. And I also said, whatever sensing of these sense object is classified as dukkha. The latter cause has been stated by me with reference to impermanence of formation. that has been stated by me with reference to formations being subject to destruction, subject to dissolution, subject to fading away, subject to cessation, subject to change. So basically whatever arises will arise and disintegrate will change. Whenever one truly understands the three kinds of feelings that are impermanent, shaped by causes and conditions, interdependent of the nature to decay and cease, one abandons tanha, craving, or longing for these feelings. To the extent where the heart is liberated, one is independent of the enjoyment of sensations. One experiences supreme happiness, which is beyond sensation. Basically, feelings are impermanent. Stress and dukkha are subject to change. This is atitnawa of the feelings. So this is the disadvantages of vedana. Atitnawa is the negative aspects of feeling. One experiences supreme happiness, which is beyond cessation. Vedana, feeling, relies on contact, basa, on cognition, which arises from the coming together in the sense basis, ayatana. The eye with the sense objects. The sense object is aramana. In visible forms, as the result, there is seeing, hearing, etc. Feeling is dependent on sense objects. Without sense objects, feelings cannot arise. For this reason, vedana, feeling, can be defined as experiencing sense objects or enjoying the flavor, rasa, of the sense stimuli. Therefore, happiness that is a cessation must rely, all sensation, on the same objects. The happiness of jhana, concentration, meditation, absorption, either the fine or the formless, relies exclusively on the mind objects, dhamma ramana. Sense pleasure, however, relies all kinds of sense objects, in particular to the five objects which are material, amisa, and refer to the five strands of sense pleasure, kama guna. Unawakened mundane beings live their lives by searching for sensual happiness, which is tantamount to entrusting their well-being, happiness, to external sense objects. Whenever the five objects of sensual enjoyment are abundant, they amuse themselves and are cheerful. But whenever these objects undergo fluctuation and change, or they are in short and unacquirable, these people become discouraged and depressed. This is in contrast to those individuals who are familiar with more refined forms of happiness, especially the happiness independent of sensation. They do not entrust their well-being to sense objects. Even if these things change and disappear, they still abide in happiness as confirmed by the words by Gautama Buddha. Devas and humans take pleasure in forms, delight in forms, rejoice in forms, rejoice in sound, rejoice in sense, rejoice in tastes, rejoice in tactile objects, rejoice in mental phenomenon. With the change, fading away, and the cessation of form, sound, sense, tastes, and tactile objects, mental phenomenon, devas and humans abide in suffering. But the Tathagata, the Arihat, the fully enlightened one, has understood, as they really are, the origin, the instability, the advantages, the dangers, and the escape from the case of forms of sound, sense, tastes, and tactile objects, mental phenomenon. Therefore, he does not take pleasures in form, delight in form, rejoice in mental phenomenon, with the change, fading away, and the cessation of form, with sound, sense, tastes, tactile objects, mental phenomenon. The Tathagata dwells happily. The experience of ordinary, mundane, unawakened people is limited and confined. They are similar only with the happiness arising from sense pleasure. When they experience a satisfying degree of pleasurable sensation, they are caught up, infatuated, begollied by this pleasure and by the objects of pleasure. When they experience painful sensation, they become downcast and agitated. They yearn for, pin their hopes on, and return of the sense pleasure because they know of no other escape from painful feeling apart from sense pleasures. Noble disciples, on the other hand, Dakinaya Bugala, noble disciples, on the other hand, who are familiar and more refined forms of happiness are not caught up with enslaved by sense object when experiencing pleasurable sensation. Likewise, when experiencing painful situation, they are not dispirited or agitated, nor do they seek out sense pleasures as an escape. This is because they know of a superior escape, ni sarana, ni pana, a freedom independent of sense pleasure. They know of a more expansive form of happiness. They have insight into true nature of happiness and unhappiness. They know of happiness free from sensation. They must not always rely on the enjoyment of sense objects. It is difficult for ordinary people to understand this happiness independent of sensation because they have no experience of it and know nothing comparable to it. Having said this, to get an inkling of it in one can point to a basic form of happiness inherent in people's mind, which is separate from the happiness derived from enjoyment of sense pleasures. This basic form of happiness is both a happiness in itself and also a support for the enjoyment of sense objects. It can be described as a mental state of clarity and calm. When there is no blemish, disturbance, or lingering anxiety in the mind, it can be called an empty mind, a pure mind, a peaceful mind. A person endowed with such a state of mind can be considered as a dwelling in happiness. Moreover, when a person with such a state of mind experiences sense impressions, whether they are by sounds, by smells, tastes, and tactile objects, he or she experiences the pleasure of this contact up to the full. This can be illustrated by looking at the opposite situation. Take, for example, someone eating whose mind at the same time is not calm, who is sad, depressed, or beset by some other form of distress. Even if the food is delicious and of the kind that he normally enjoys, on this occasion he will not find it delicious. He may have to force himself to eat, or he may not be able to swallow the food at all. If, however, his mind is cheerful, he will savor the flavor of the food fully. Even if the food is not the best, he may find it delicious. Another example is someone whose body is dirty, grimy, sweaty, or itchy. Even if she sits and listens to music, she won't feel at ease. Or if she tries to do some detailed work, she won't be very effective. But if she takes a shower and cleans her body, she will feel at ease. She will derive the greatest amount of pleasure from sense contact and be able to complete meticulous kinds of works. Person endowed with such internal or basic happiness are also abide in enjoyed and external happiness derived from sense objects. Besides benefiting from both kinds of happiness, internal and external, their mental capabilities are also enhanced. On the contrary, people who are deprived of this internal happiness lose out on both accounts, both in terms of internal and external happiness. Moreover, their mental capabilities are also compromised. It is possible to cultivate this basic form of happiness and to make it more pure, prominent and profound than most people are familiar with. One can get a sense of happiness of nipita by way of this comparison. In sum, nipita is both a form of happiness itself. It enhances one's ability to experience happiness. When people relate properly to sensuality, reduce their infatuation with pleasurable sense objects, no longer entrust their happiness to these objects, and stop indulging in sense pleasures, they are prepared to experience the refined happiness of jhana. When they have experienced the happiness of jhana, concentration, meditation, absorption of the fine, material, or the formless, and yet still wish to enjoy sense pleasures, they do so in a way characterized as natural and gentle. Generally speaking, they won't perform unwholesome deeds for the sake of attaining sense pleasures, because they see greater value in happiness of jhana, concentration, meditation, absorption of the fine, material, or the formless. In addition to the happiness of jhana, concentration, meditation, absorption of the fine, material, or the formless, concentration, meditation, absorption, relies on the basis of spiritual virtue. When one experiences happiness of jhana, concentration, meditation, absorption of the fine, material, or the formless, the mind becomes absorbed in the refined meditation object associated with concentration, meditation, absorption of the fine, material, or the formless jhanas, of which there are many levels of gradually increasing profundity. At the final stage, it is as if one disappears to the state of supreme subtlety. This can be compared to what people describe as a mystical state. These are supreme meditation attainments which are difficult to reach. Someone who is able to relinquish the attachment to this extremely refined state of absorption in these meditative attainments, who has both uprooted an attachment to sense pleasure and to the attachment of jhana, who has indeed relinquished an attachment to all things, reaches perfect liberation, nipita. Nipita is the opposite of these aforementioned conditions. Whether it can be sense pleasure or meditation of attainment, jhana samapatti, this is because the state of sense enjoyment and the state of jhana both require an engagement with sense objects, a holding on to sense objects, a merging with sense objects. One is entrusted oneself and subject to sense objects. Nipita, on the other hand, is a state of detachment, liberation, and freedom. Through nipita stands in direct contrast to these other states, a person who realized nipita is fully prepared to enjoy all level of happiness in the most optimum way, without any danger or harm. To sum all this up, those people who realize nipita, besides experiencing the happiness of nipita itself, are able to enjoy all the preceding kinds of happiness and to savor the enjoyment of these to the fullest. Those who realize nipita but did not previously pass through the various stages of concentrative attainment are not qualified to experience some of these attainments, but they still reach nipita and experience the supreme happiness of liberation, vimutti sukha. There exists no greater happiness than the happiness of liberation. When one abandons sense pleasures, one is entitled to the happiness of jhana. When one abandons happiness of jhana, one is entitled to the happiness of nipita and the happiness of liberation, which is secure, peaceful, bright. One is able to return to enjoy all previous kinds of happiness. The fact that awakened beings renounce sexual intercourse and abandon or disengage from concentration of attainments, jhana samapatti, enables them to reach a superior form of spiritual attainment, samapatti. In order to reach the freedom of nipita, one must first relinquish everything, including the bliss of jhana. By relinquishing everything, one obtains all.